moving on now to the diencephalon. Diencephalon. So let's actually just point this out here. So the diencephalon is made up of two main components here. So I just want you to know the thalamus, right? So the thalamus, which is this kind of this egg-like structure, right, in the central portion here. And there's also the hypothalamus, which is this component just underneath the thalamus there. Right, and so the thalamus and the hypothalamus make up the diencephalon. The role of the thalamus is really an intermediary between some incoming signals in different parts of the brain. Right, so this passes information to the cerebrum from the body and from other parts of the brain. Right, so we'll see there's different basically connections. Right, so we'll see the midbrain, right, sends signals into the diencephalon, which receives signals from the cerebellum. But it's the role of the thalamus, right, to distribute these incoming signals from the body and these other parts of the brain here. The hypothalamus, so this kind of small, inconspicuous part here, has a lot of involvement with controlling the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. If you remember, the autonomic nervous system is the involuntary control of basically of our organs, and also the endocrine system. Right, so it's the kind of that involuntary control of your organs and your hormone production. Some examples, right, of specifically, right, so it's involved heavily with sleep and temperature control, right, and we'll see actually there's quite a few structures that perform those sleep and temperature control functions. It's something that's fairly well regulated within the brain. Right, so again, thalamus and hypothalamus make up the diencephalon. Right, the thalamus passes information to the cerebrum from the body and other parts of the brain, and the hypothalamus controls a lot of the autonomic nervous system, the involuntary actions. So now moving more inferior, right, to the brainstem. So the brainstem is comprised of three different parts, right? So the brainstem, we have the midbrain, which is like this area here. We then have what are called the pons, right? So the pons is this kind of oval structure there. And then beneath the pons, so inferior to the pons, right, we have the medulla oblongata. Right, and again, so one of the main function of the brainstem are to control those automatic behaviors. So sleeping, heart rate, breathing, temperature control. Right, so all of that automatic involuntary behavior is regulated within the brainstem. Then we also see that in the hypothalamus as well. Another kind of key function of the brainstem is it acts as a connection right between the cerebellum. So you can see the cerebellum is this part here. Right, so this is the cerebellum, and we can see that the cerebellum, right, is going to basically connect to the brainstem, and that way it'll be able to send information right from the brainstem up to the diencephalon, which can then distribute to the cerebrum. The next thing, right, that we want to take a look at is the cerebellum, right? And so the cerebellum is similar in structure a little bit to the cerebrum, in that it has both gray and white matter, right, as well as smaller grooves. So it is grooved, less pronounced, as you can see here, as the cerebrum, but there's definitely definitely it has more texture, if you will, right? And so again, as mentioned, there's this gray matter and white matter component, right? And so what we see with the gray matter, so the axons, right, end up making this fairly distinct kind of a tree-like pattern, right? So all of these here, these are the different myelinated axons of the cerebellum, and it's what's called it's called the arbor vitae, right? So it just translates to the tree of life, but it's basically the myelinated axons of the cerebellum, right, that are produced coming from the gray matter here. So the key feature, the key function of the cerebellum is to was with motor control, right? So there's has a lot, a big part in how we move and how we control our motor function, right? So there's a lot of connection, a lot of signals being sent to the cerebrum, so basically through the midbrain, right, up to the diencephalon. But the cerebellum and the cerebrum really work together to help coordinate motor control. So this is a key feature when it comes to our day-to-day functioning activity. Okay, so now that we've looked at the kind of the four different aspects of the brain, we're going to take kind of a different look now at some of the protective features, or some of the protective mechanisms that we have to keep our brain safe, essentially. Right, and so how we do that is through what are called meninges. Right, and so meninges they're protective sheets of tissue that surround the brain and spinal cord. Right, so basically they're surrounding the central nervous system. And what we see is they're made of three different layers. Right, so we have what's called dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. So we'll take a look at each of these layers. So we'll have if we look at this diagram here, right, so you can see it's a cross section of the skull. So we've cut out the front of the skull here, right, so you can see some of the layers. So here is our skull bone, right, there's our skin, that's fine, right, so here's our bone. And the first layer, so we're going to take a look here. So here's our bone on this cut side here, right, and so our outermost layer is what's called the dura mater, right, so we have dura mater right here. And so dura mater really means tough mother. It is the thickest, and it provides the most amount of protection of the three meninges. Right, so there's this thick sheet of tissue here. So it's technically made up of two different layers. We're not worried about that. So we'll consider all of this here, right, to be the dura mater. So if we have a look on the side here, so there's our bone here. So this section here is going to be our dura mater. The next layer, right, so kind of this middle layer, it's a little bit thinner, right, so it's much thinner than the dura mater. It's called the arachnoid mater, right? And so this is going to be this layer around here. And so there's the arachnoid mater. You can see here, so that sheet there is called the arachnoid mater. And below that, right, so not immediately below, but the final layer, which is the thinnest layer, is called the pia mater. And the pia mater rests directly against the brain and spinal cord. Right, so we can see the pia mater here is a very, very thin layered sheet. Right, so the pia mater, you can see here is that thin layer pressed right up against the brain. And what's really important is between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, right? So the space between the pia and arachnoid, so you can see here, is called the subarachnoid space, right? So the space between here and all of this, remember that's the arachnoid mater that comes down here. So the arachnoid mater is here, your pia mater still is here. So all of this subarachnoid space, so beneath sub the arachnoid, right? And this is what contains what's called cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. Right, and we'll get into CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, a little bit later, but this is going to provide a lot of protection. This is a very robust protective mechanism. So it's a little bit of basically a fluid barrier between the brain and the skull. And again, we'll get to that. So there are three layers. We have the thickest, the dura mater, right? And then we have our thinner arachnoid mater and our very thin, right against the brain, pia mater, which contains the cerebral spinal fluid within the subarachnoid space.